Thank you very much, and thank you for those of you that are able to stay and don't have to run to the airport very quickly. I appreciate it so much, and appreciate the opportunity to speak today. You know, as I was really digging into the details of lung cancer and COVID, I kind of thought, as I sat here this all weekend, it really wouldn't be a conference without talking about COVID. So we're going to have to bring up some of those issues. So here's some of the things that we're going to review. What were the delays in diagnosis? Why did that happen? The impact of COVID on the delivery of care to cancer patients, adverse outcomes of lung cancer patients specifically, disruption to research, and then what the future holds. So obviously when we look at screening for cancers, we know that screening decreased when the COVID pandemic first hit. And what the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force did is that they actually went April of 2020 and then went back 5 years, same period of time, and then compared the screening rates of those times. And if we look, we'll see that there was an 87% decline in cervical cancer, in breast cancer, an 84% decline in cervical cancer, 80% decline in colorectal cancer screenings, and a 36% decrease in prostate cancer. If you look at lung cancer screening, there really wasn't that much of a difference. But the problem is that not enough lung cancer screening is happening as it is. I think we heard earlier this weekend that only about 6% of all patients that are eligible for lung cancer screening are actually having those tests done. So what's the result of that? Well, when you look at the result of those percentages, it's pretty remarkable. However, if you really look at the absolute numbers, you'll see that the estimated number of breast cancer women that did not get screening on time, 3.9 million. 3.8 million colorectal patients and 1.6 million prostate patients. There were geographic differences. The Northeast, where we are now, experienced the sharpest declines in screening, while the West had actually a slower recovery compared to the Midwest and the South. By socioeconomic status, the largest screening decline was observed in individuals that were in the highest socioeconomic societal index quartile. And so that actually led to a narrowing in the disparity of cancer screenings, but not for the right reasons, right? So our anticipated outcomes include delayed diagnosis and marked increases in the number of avoidable cancer deaths. And new diagnoses actually decline 13 to 23%, depending on the cancer. And not because there's less cancer, but certainly because there was less detection of that cancer. We're still working on the backlog and we're trying to catch up. Well, there's no change in lung cancer screening. That's no big deal. Or is it? If you look at these SEER stages of localized, regional, and distant stages for lung cancer and compare their 5-year survival rate, look at what happens to a lung cancer patient specifically. If they're diagnosed with distant disease already, their 5-year survival rate is only 8%. And it's actually predicted that lung cancer patients specifically could have as much as a 3 to 5% increase in mortality because of these delayed diagnoses. Found this on Instagram, and I think we're all very aware of what our patients were going through at the time. So what's the impact of COVID on the delivery of care? Well, according to the American Cancer Society survey in May of 20, 79% of active treatment cancer patients have had a disruption in their care. So they knew March was when everything shut down. By May, they were asking, hey, what has happened to your treatment? Compared to April, where it was only about 27%. So the delays and the active treatments kept getting worse and worse as far as interruptions. And it's not necessarily leading to potentially worse outcomes, but potentially other concerns. One of the issues wasn't just patients weren't getting diagnosed, but the ones that were diagnosed couldn't get their treatment, right? Surgery was delayed, radiation was delayed, chemotherapy was delayed, even hormonal therapies were delayed. Some of this was self-induced from the patients because they were afraid. They were afraid to leave their homes. They were afraid to go out and be exposed. Other patient factors included cardiac clearance. Somebody was on the launching pad for surgery. They needed cardiac clearance, but the cardiology office was shut down. They couldn't get the tests that they needed. What if they had wound infection? Then they wouldn't come into the office to get checked as usual, and so those infections could ultimately lead to death. What if they needed more imaging? You know, we talked about neoadjuvant therapy in these lung cancer patients. What if they needed PET scans, CT scans, biopsies? All of that was getting delayed. Even vascular access device insertion, that wasn't happening either. Not to mention when a cancer patient then loses their job because everything shuts down, they have the financial issues, they've lost their insurance, potentially transportation, and access to their care. What are some of the unknown effects of modified treatment regimens? Well, at that point in time, it was crazy for us to think, but cancer surgeries were considered elective. And so those were placed on the back burner. And so how many more patients had to go through symptoms that otherwise could have been relieved from the surgery? 36 to 51% of cancer centers reported a change in treatment plan for chemotherapeutic agents during the height of the pandemic compared to the pre-pandemic levels. Fortunately, we do have alternative dosing schedules for immunotherapy. For example, the Pembro was going to Q6 weeks instead of Q3 weeks. But there was a lot of therapy that we don't have proven dosing delays and changes. Like, let's say the Folfox, instead of every 2 weeks, it was going to every 3 weeks or every 4 weeks. And we don't know what those kinds of differences are going to do to our patients. Up to 56% of oncologists actually did admit to changing schedules. And 66% of radiation oncologists said existing patients with cancer experienced interruptions in treatment due to radiation due to the pandemic. And it could have been anywhere from 8 to 45 days. We know for a fact that our head and neck cancer patients, if they are delayed 5 days for their radiation therapy, that really significantly increases their mortality from their disease. So let's look at some of these CTs. I found these really, really interesting. So if you look, the slide on the left, the CT on the left, is just a COVID lung, and that's what it looks like compared to a COVID negative lung. So imagine if you were to transpose lung cancer on top of that COVID lung. So if you look right here, hidden, this is a patient with COVID positive. Hidden within this whole consolidation there is a lung mass. You can see that right there denoted by the black arrows. The white arrows actually show just some of the COVID inflammation. Then if you look higher up in that same patient, closer towards the apex, this is all just inflammatory response to COVID. This is the same patient, and if you look, what are other signs that there's more than just COVID going on in this patient? Well, if you look, this is the trachea here, this little white arrow on the left. You can see that the trachea is compressed. Obviously, that should be nice and round, and it's just a little sliver of a line there. And then if you look at the slide on the right, that little star, that's a very large lymph node that obviously doesn't belong there. But usually the adenopathy in COVID doesn't get as large as the adenopathy that we see in lung cancer. So what happens? What happens inside? Why are patients why are cancer patients so much sicker? Why does that even happen? We have to look at some of the cellular aspects of that. So there was a small survey not long after the pandemic actually started where 121 cancer patients who contracted COVID died within a 30-day study window. And so that was a mortality rate of 14%. And that started really the ball rolling for everyone to be looking at what's going on. Cancer, as well as some of our treatments, actually, are associated with an increased likelihood of inducing certain cardiovascular complication in patients. The combined effect of this, along with those of COVID, really can be devastating for them. Some of the specific complications that can be further exacerbated by COVID include blood stasis, vascular wall damage, and hypercoagulation states, all of which can increase the chance of thrombosis. So think about pancreatic cancer patients, maybe patients on tamoxifen, for example. The exact mechanism, though, of the synergy between COVID and the cancer the cancer patient, COVID within the cancer patient, it leads to these cardiovascular complications, higher risk of the cardiovascular complications. We just aren't 100% sure, but I did find some interesting information. It's generally believed that this hyperinflammatory reaction in both of the conditions, when they're combined, they promote dysfunction in the cardiovascular system, and it's related to these neutrophil extracellular traps. If you look here, this is a photomicrograph, and the yellow dotted line outlines microvasculature, okay? So that's a very small blood vessel. The red are platelets, and sort of the brighter white, gray, light blue colors are these nets, or the neutrophil extracellular traps. And if you can imagine, these neutrophils have just formed webs, right? They're just all connecting. And they've formed webs within the microvasculature, therefore not allowing the platelets to flow freely and then causing the clotting. What about lung cancer specifically? Well, unfortunately, patients with lung cancer have a 7.7-fold higher risk of developing COVID and a 3.6-fold higher risk of hospitalization and a 5.7-fold higher risk of death. So we need to look more at the synergy of lung cancer and COVID. And if we looked at that, the mortality of lung cancer patients is higher, 32.4% versus 25% with COVID and any other types of cancer. And the exact reasons for this vulnerability are really not clear, but some of the patients also were found to mount very poor antibody responses to the vaccinations. So is there something about the milieu of lung cancer that causes you to not have that same immunity, the same ability to mount that immune response? Is it molecular based? Is it dependent upon the treatment that they've been on? Is it related to immunotherapy? Is it the comorbidities that lung cancer patients often have with them? Most of the time they've been smokers, they have COPD, and just are not in good health in general. And so we don't know, does COVID cause progression of their lung cancer? Does it cause lung cancer? All of these things that we just still don't know, but we continue to look at. I found this very, very interesting, that fewer cancer patients received mechanical ventilation than non-cancer patients. This was a study that was performed by ISARC, which is the International Severe Acute Respiratory Emerging Infectious Consortium. Say that 10 times fast. But they looked at about 70,000 patients. So if you look, these were patients that did not have cancer, so about 60,000 patients that did not have cancer. They went on to critical care, 14.6% of them in the ICU, and then 8.9% of those patients went on to invasive mechanical ventilation, okay? Here's the problem. If they had cancer, almost half went to critical care, and then even less went on to have mechanical ventilation. If they were on active treatment, it was the same thing that we're seeing. That seems very counterintuitive. We know our patients are sicker. Why weren't they going to the unit? Why weren't they getting put on a ventilator? And a lot of that has to do with the treatment bias of our intensivists. Everyone's nodding their head, like, yes, absolutely, we have this fight all the time, right? They thought, okay, we'll have this non-cancer patient with COVID and a cancer patient with COVID. The cancer patient's not likely to survive, so I'm gonna be more aggressive with a non-cancer patient. But that wasn't necessarily the right thing to do. And so we have to continue to fight for our patients. I wanted to put this up here so you could see all these databases for reference. There's so much data out there now within 2 years. And so these are some of the great studies that you can look at that have really been capturing data of COVID and our cancer patients, and it really divides things up nicely. So just in your spare time, take a look at some of this, but it really is fascinating. So how is cancer research affected? Well, on February 9th of this year, AACR unveiled the report on the impact of COVID-19 on cancer research and patient care. There was a virtual briefing that included panel discussions with patients and patient advocates, and it was fantastic. But what we found was that COVID interrupted all aspects of the cancer research and cancer care continuum. There was loss of productivity due to the suspension of laboratory activities. 66% of the labs were closed. This was a piece that I hadn't really thought of because I'm not a bench researcher, I'm in the clinic. But if you think about it, everything shut down, the labs shut down, they closed their doors, and whatever was. So they lost so many things. They lost cell lines, they lost mouse colonies, and as a result, everything up until that point was lost as well. Obviously, there was suspended enrollment in clinical trials. I remember specifically seeing a patient thinking, oh my gosh, she's gonna be great for this trial. And then they're like, nope, no enrollment. They've closed down enrollment right now. So that was really getting frustrating. Then there were delays in reporting the results because no one was actively looking at all that data and compiling it. It was found that the NIH and the grantees lost $16 billion. That was just a direct cost to the system and a direct cost of a lot of our tax money, frankly. However, researchers were shifted to COVID research once those labs opened up. And it's the decades of research that cancer research did in mRNA vaccines for cancer immunotherapy that actually paved the way for the development of the COVID vaccines at an unprecedented speed. And that can't be forgotten. Honestly, it was really because of the cancer researchers. And then there was no sharing of information because there were no conferences, because there was no travel. So it was 2019, last time that we were here. And so it's been great to be back in person again and also have the flexibility of now being virtual because everyone's gotten so good at it, frankly. What about lung cancer research specifically? Lung cancer clinical trials, the enrollment was down 14% during the pandemic, and the most dramatic decrease was between April and August of 2020, with a slow improvement, but not back up to baseline between October and December of 2020. As you know, we never stopped working, right? It was business as usual. We did everything that we could to kind of keep going and make sure our patients were getting what they needed. But it still never went back up to where it was. A lot of the challenges were mostly patient related. They were concerned about going outside, contracting COVID, securing good transportation. There were travel restrictions. I mean, if you look at CTCA, their entire business model is based upon travel and patients coming to them, right? And then there was no lab or radiology access. But what happened? Now we're looking at the redesigning of cancer clinical trials. Before the pandemic, everything was very site-centric, right? Here's where we are, and here's where we're doing the research. Patients, you must come to us. But then, as the pandemic hit, FDA started rethinking. They're like, oh, well, okay, maybe we could mail medicine to the patient. Maybe they could be monitored remotely. Maybe they could stay at home, and maybe the docs could check in via televisits. So I really think that we're gonna see a lot more of a change and a shift of the way clinical trials are being run. Here's where we started. Back on February 1 of 2020, 11,953 cases were confirmed in Wuhan, China. A year later, we have 104 million cases, over 2 million fatalities. This is February of 2022. And if you look at the numbers today, there's over 600 million confirmed cases of COVID and over 6 million fatalities, which is why we're still in the pandemic, which is why it's still happening around us and we all need to be careful. So what do? You have to continue to be your patient's advocate. Bottom line, educate your non-oncology colleagues about your patient's cancer. Don't let them make assumptions that aren't real. You have to let them know that these patients have longer survivals, even if they're metastatic. Get your patients vaccinated and boosted. You just have to keep telling them. Even if they say no, just say, okay, well, that's still my recommendation, right? And then you need to know your community resources, because oftentimes our patients are coming to us. They're saying, where do I go? What do I need to do? And you need to know the right things to do for your patients. Where do they get their vaccine? Where can they get Evusheld, the prophylactic antibodies that they need, the Paxlovid, the treatments that they need, and then where can they get testing? So if you stay informed, you can keep your patients informed and keep them protected. So thank you very much for allowing me to have some time with you today at the end of this fantastic conference, and thank you to Total Health for putting on a wonderful event.
Hi, I'm a research nurse, so I work in cancer, but during COVID, I actually shifted to all COVID studies in New York, Queens, so we were really hit hard. I was the only nurse in the public hospital, so I saw a lot of the patients. It was very stressful. And I saw a lot of the cancer patients die from COVID. So I'm very passionate about what I'm going to say next. That might put a lot of responsibility on the oncologist, but I find now, as we're going into the winter, one of the things I get afraid of is our lung cancer patients, or actually all of our cancer patients getting COVID. I realize that Paxlovid you have to get within 5 days, or the monoclonal antibodies you have to get within 5 days. If you kind of miss that window, you've missed that window. And if they progress, they've progressed, and there's not really a lot to give after that. So, I find I'm very frustrated when we get a call and we say, oh, I have COVID, I'm diagnosed with COVID. And everyone's like, well, let's see how you do. And I'm just like, I feel like we're playing Russian roulette with that kind of thinking. And we haven't had too many patients now, but we're coming into the winter. And, who knows what's going to happen. I mean, hopefully, it won't be that bad. It will be a less virulent version of the virus, but I guess I like to think, let's be proactive, and as a cancer community, think about what our plan is. What do you think about that, or what are you doing?
Absolutely, 100% agree with you. We do need to be aggressive, and we actually have signage within our clinic trying to educate patients, particularly that are on active therapy, to let us know if that they have been recently diagnosed with COVID, or if they feel like they have symptoms. We don't do COVID testing for obvious reasons, because we don't want a potentially positive patient within the clinic. However, we do stress to our patients, you need to get tested even if you have the sniffles. Call us immediately. We've also done some education within the community, of the primary care community in particular, because they're getting a lot of these calls, right? And so that if they find out that they have a cancer patient that has been diagnosed, here's what you need to do. You need to initiate the Paxlovid and be aggressive with their therapy. Absolutely. So we've done a lot of educating for that, and you're right. Here we come up with this next season. Right now we're actually doing a lot of vaccine education. Get your flu shot.
What about, maybe oncologists are going to get mad that I'm saying this, but, they're used to giving all this toxic chemotherapy, so in my simple mind, I'm thinking, you can write a prescription for Paxlovid, and it gets delivered to the house. And all this waiting around with the primary care and wondering if they're going to do it or not, why aren't the oncologists taking that on, or should they be?
A lot of times, what we have found is we'll find out after the fact. The patient doesn't let us know, and so then there's nothing that we can do about it. So a lot of our education is really focused on the patient, saying, let us know if you get it.
I'm finding the opposite. They are letting us know, and I'm finding.
And then no one's doing it. Yeah, and I mean, I think a lot of that is really just education, because I think even within my own practice group, there's been a lot of hesitancy. Oh, do we really want to? Yes, you do. You want to be aggressive, absolutely.
I've had someone say to me, a nurse practitioner say to me, oh, I got to protect my license with this. I'm like, well, what if you don't give it and the patient dies? What's your responsibility?
Yeah, there's no, Paxlovid is free. You've got to give it within 5 days of the treatment, and I don't know that I even understand that reasoning. For those online, the question was about just nurse practitioner worried about protecting her license or something over prescribing, so I don't think that's going to be a problem. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone.